I have got a couple of slides, but mostly it's just a list of useful literature for you. We're mostly going to talk through our experience. So I'm an OT and I'm Elizabeth Julian. I have the pleasure of being in a practice placement manager position in one of the big trusts in Birmingham, University Hospitals Birmingham. And so that's why I've been involved with a slightly different model of taking our students. So I'll hand over to Sharon to introduce herself.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sharon Marshall. I'm a senior occupational therapist. I have also had the pleasure of working in quite a unique setting. Up until about 2 months ago now, I was in a AHP clinical educator role. I must say, apologies for the lighting. The room is terrible, so I might switch over in a minute if I'm able to. But yes, my current role is in a team lead position within specialist surgery. But going back to my original role as clinical educator, I was able to support a variety of students, and that's something we're going to talk about during this session shortly.
Lovely. Thanks, Sharon. I'm just going to share my slides just whilst we talk through. They're really just, I've put points on the slides for us to talk through. And then if you've been to a placement cafe before, you will know that the second half of the session is there for questions and answers. So hopefully there'll be lots of things for discussion. And I will just preface this whole thing by saying, whilst we had what I think of as pretty wonderful experiences, it doesn't mean we've got it all cracked and we've got it all right. And we're very happy to discuss both the benefits and challenges. So that's us, Sharon and Liz, and we're going to talk about taking multiple students. As I've said, we've had 4 quite often occupational therapy students together, but sometimes only 3 and sometimes only 2. So we're talking about multiple students in general. It doesn't have to be about taking 4. It might just be that you're looking at moving to a 2-to-1 model for the first time. Can I just have a little wave from Jen and Sharon and Anne to say that you can see my slides? Yes, okay. Yes. That's good. I thought I'd just better check before I carry on. So hopefully this will allow me to just make it a proper slideshow for you. Oh, let me not do that. Sorry. Let me do it from down here. There we are. So the second slide, as I say, has just got points on for us to talk about, really. So the first part is really about planning, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to you as occupational therapists, but it's very important that whether you take 1 student or whether you take 2, 3, 4, that your planning is absolutely on point. And we have learnt this absolutely. We know between us, don't we, Sharon, that when we've planned really well, it's gone so much better than when we have not planned as well. Is that fair to say?
That's definitely correct.
So the planning I'll talk about briefly, and Sharon will absolutely kind of jump in. The planning for taking our students has revolved around lots of things. So the classics are, of course, around booking both the time and the room for our weekly supervisions, as well as our halfways and finals, as well as one-to-ones. The one-to-ones we're talking about are making sure that if you've got a multiple student model, they do get some time alone at the very beginning of placement, because of course there might be things that they want to discuss. Oh, sorry, we just I could just hear someone for a second. There'll be times when our learners need to talk about things that are personal to them, that they may not feel happy to talk about in front of their peers and colleagues. However, what I will just say is that generally speaking, we've conducted supervision in a 2, 3, 4 to 1 scenario, so that they're having paired or group supervision. I think this is a real change for some people, and I think it's something, it does take some skill from you as an educator, but it is a time saver. The second point on there being time commitment, I think that what having multiple students shouldn't be is double the time. It is more time. I'm not going to sit here and say that it isn't. However, if you plan well and use your time well, it doesn't have to be double. the time. And we can talk about that a little bit more. Sharon, do you want to just say something about the planning from your point of view, because you were the woman on the ground, as it were. What things did you involve in the planning?
Yes, definitely. So definitely planning your diaries, particularly having more than that traditional one-to-one. A lot more goes into it, really. The planning of the placement, introducing the placement to the students, making them aware of the expectations, where to go, even the simplest of things, sending out letters to make sure that they had the information ahead of time, planning for, like Liz was saying, the one-to-ones in particular. They're very, very key, and that's a safe space for them to open up and share their any reasonable adjustments or any previous placement experience that they've had as well. So planning definitely goes into it. Planning the day, sometimes planning the supervision and the halfway and the finals, as Liz was saying. The time constraints, well, that it goes hand in hand. Again, that's where the planning comes in. Planning those times when you can do the assessments with the students, when you've got time for them, and sharing your time across as many students that you're going to be having. I think that was another key point as well.
I think it's worth saying, and I suspect we'll talk about this more in the discussion. My feeling is that the expectations, as it's on the slide, and as Sharon has said there, they are so important, because our most recent cohort, I say they were Sharon's, but I helped because Sharon was moving into a new role and I needed to cover. So we did share them a little bit in that sense, because we had to, but it was still a 4-to-1 in that sense. Our most recent cohort, they were final year master's students, so they'd had previous placements, they'd had undergraduate degrees, and they were really an excellent group. And of course, you can get learners in a multiple student model from any level. And I don't think that matters exactly. But what does matter, whatever level they're at and whatever they're bringing with them, is that we discuss those expectations. So one of the things that was said when we had our most recent cohort, I introduced the fact that they were going to be having a group supervision. And the first supervision that we had, this is separate from their one-to-ones. In fact, I did that supervision. And so we sat there as a group and we talked about what we would do, how we would do it. Of course, they still needed to prepare in the same way they would usually bring their preparation. However, if they had been used to having an hour dedicated just to them on their previous placement, that isn't what they were going to get on this placement. They were going to have 4 of them for, perhaps we sort of took out maybe an hour and a half. So we didn't try and fit 4 of them into an hour, but equally, I wasn't going to do a 4-hour supervision. And you would have to make your decision about what time you or someone in the team is able to provide. But we aimed for about an hour and a half, so that we had time to have a bit of a 5-minute settle in, and that everybody got some dedicated time. So I usually sort of said, why don't we have about 15 minutes each for you to lead your section. That doesn't mean that the others aren't involved or listening or sitting looking out of the window. It was very much meant to be a group interaction and discussion. But each individual student will have done their preparation, and then I essentially said to them, I'm looking for the newspaper headlines. I still want you to do a full preparation, but I want you to really think of the things and prioritize the things that you want to use the time to discuss. Having a group supervision doesn't mean that they can never have one-to-one time again. And that was another part of the expectations that we made clear, that they would have their one-to-one on their own and their halfway and their final. They would have group supervision weekly, but in between times, if they had specific things that they needed to talk about from a pastoral and personal point of view, or from a practice point of view, that they needed separate time for, then it was their responsibility to make that time with Sharon or with me, if it was me on that particular day. And they did that very well. They seemed to take to that very well. We definitely gave them separate one-to-one time, but it was not as much as if we gave each of them 4 you know, an hour each a week, so 4 hours a week. It did not come. Is that fair to say, Sharon? It did not add up to that amount of time.
Definitely, yeah. I think it was also, I think they were reassured as well, like you said, to have that one-to-one time, because there are going to be things or occasions, and we gave them that autonomy also to be able to identify that time, to be able to come to us and, okay, we'll go off and we'll plan it in, or get them to book the room, or, you know, to plan that time and facilitate that one-to-one time that they might have needed.
So again, you might have questions about these things, and we can talk about them in the second half for sure. So that's how we approach the group supervision. And I think having a conversation in real life yesterday at one of our hospitals with some OT colleagues who've recently tried a 2-to-1 model for the first time, one of the things that they brought up is that actually it's a real change for them to move out of this one-to-one dynamic and this one-to-one model. You know, that's how they've always done their placements as educators. It's how the students that they have had placements before. And so making that change, as we all know, we know it for ourselves as people, we know it for ourselves as professionals, asking our patients and clients to make changes or to work with them whilst they're making changes they want to make. And it's no different when we're making changes in our professional lives, that actually it takes a little bit of getting used to. You have to be more conscious of these things the first or second go around. I think the key thing for me is being open about it. And as I said, my colleagues yesterday were saying, you know, they're willing to give it a go, but it's something that felt like a real change. And so certainly the first time they tried it, my colleagues found that there were 2 students, and so they were doing a 2-hour supervision, which is absolutely what I wanted them not to fall into that trap. But they did, and I can understand why. And I think that, you know, Sharon and I have done this lots of times now, and so I've got to remember that it didn't feel easy at the beginning, and I think that's something that Sharon will bear out perhaps later when she talks, you know, about what it was really like kind of day to day. But you know, we've been doing this for a couple of years now, haven't we, Sharon?
Yes.
And so it's worth understanding that. So we've talked a little bit about planning, and as Sharon said, we would send out a letter by email, I might add, not a paper letter. One thing I would just say on that is that I think we sort of discovered that people don't read attachments. So we'd put information in the email, and we'd also then say, please look at the letter where the majority of the detail was. And it was very clear that they often didn't get read. I'm not saying nobody read them, but the majority of people didn't read them. So another part of the planning was that we did a pre-placement teams meeting. Now, you in your areas, and we certainly used to do face-to-face pre-placement meetings, but we haven't done that now. It's really very much since COVID. And in many ways, it's a good idea to be able to use the virtual platform. And so that's what we did. You can do whatever you wish. But it was lovely because it meant that we got to see each other's faces and got a feel for each other, and we were able to allay some fears and help make things seem less nerve-wracking, I guess, for what they were coming to. We could find out if they already knew each other as peers or not. And it gave us the opportunity to say, did you read the letter? These were the things that were in the letter, because they would obviously ask us questions, and often they were things that were written in the letter. So at least it was a chance for us to link those up and say, yes, we can answer, and please do read the letter. We were able to give them pre-reading and all those things that you would do for a single student. You do the same for 2 of them or 3 of them, and so on. We've talked about the time commitment. We've talked a bit about expectations both ways. And one of our previous students, very honestly and brilliantly, with a great attitude, was able to express to me that she was really used to having a one-to-one supervision and felt like the idea of having a group, she was worried it would take something away from her experience, because she quite right, and I can understand it, she was very brilliant and insightful, and she said, you know, I always feel like supervision was my time to shine and almost show off, look at all this work I've done and look at this thinking and this reflection. And I guess she was a little worried that having a group supervision would take away from that. Now, the person in question, I don't know if she's on the call. If she is, then please talk to everybody later. But I think as time went on, they all found their way with this group supervision, and they would all participate. And actually the joy of a group supervision is that peer assisted learning, that the information wasn't always coming from me, that actually often somebody would bring a situation up or a scenario or a piece of learning, and they would discuss it together. together, and I was really just a facilitator, and that's the skill you need within a group supervision. And it was lovely, actually. I find it really joyful to be in those group settings. So again, we can talk more about that. There are pros and cons to all these things. I'm not saying one way is the only way. I'll move on because time is ticking away to dynamics. So I'm sure this is something that's in the mind of a lot of people, this idea of how do dynamics come into these multiple student models, and how do we manage them? Now, I would argue that even in a one-to-one, you can have difficult dynamics, and that's between you as an educator and the learner, or between the learner and other members of the team, or if you've got teams where there's more than one-to-one situation happening, and there are still potential dynamics there. So I don't think it's only something you need to think about with groups. However, I think it's reasonable to say that, of course, if we're looking at doing group supervision, if we're looking at them working in pairs or threes or fours in the clinical space, then of course, just like in a multidisciplinary team, we need to consider the dynamics of that situation. Sharon, do you want to sort of come in here in terms of scenarios and how how we dealt with them?
Wow, this for me, dynamics was one of the most interesting things that I was exposed to. And I think from the get-go, very first cohort. Now, I explained earlier my role was AHP clinical educator. So I had the pleasure of working with students that were OTs and physiotherapists. So the first cohort of physios in particular, I believe, Liz, it was a mixture between master level and BSc, I believe. And the master level students were final placement. The BSc were first year. I think they were on their second placement. That was a dynamic in itself. Then there was a dynamic between the professions. And then there were dynamics between just the personalities of the students. So there was a mixed bag of different things that went on. But it was an opportunity for them to reflect. So as anything raised its head, I was either able to take them to one side, one-to-one, and have a discussion, and we'll come on to the coaching in a minute, and try to get them to think about how they feel it went, or that particular situation. I won't go into too many details, but they had a chance to reflect, and it made them think about their own styles, their own leadership styles, their own personalities, and the expectations that they might have for themselves, and how that might be actually different, what they want from others, and how that might be a clash in itself. So I found it really, really interesting. I mean, at points, I will say that I also had dietetic students. I wasn't their direct supervisor, but there was a mix of OT, PTs, and dietetic students. And there was also positives about dynamics. Yes, there was the differences between the professions, but it was so lovely. And I think Liz will back me up on this one. It was lovely to see them working together as a true MDT. They started to realize how important that holistic approach, that team approach was, and they really valued each other. So they were very good at being open to learn about other professions, and acknowledging that, oh, we need a dietetic for this lady who has dietary needs. We'll have a conversation about that if they didn't know, or they'll grab a physio, and if there were specific questions they had about chest. But to be clear, in terms of the physios, again, we linked in with qualified physios in order to facilitate their specific learning needs. But all in all, I thought the dynamics was a really interesting journey, and they learned a lot about themselves as well at the other end. And I like to think they've left the placement. They've given us feedback about some of the challenges, haven't they, Liz? And we've also had the opportunity to work on the situations that might have led to the dynamic clashes. But yeah, I thought it was a quite an interesting area. So it's something that you definitely need to be aware about, and almost be really eyes open and hands on to see see it before it kind of develops into something that it doesn't need to be. I mean, that is not always going to be possible, but the majority of the time I think you can.
Thank you so much, and I think it's really worth saying here, and I feel like I'm repeating myself. I say this to so many people so often, and it's really worth saying now is that, as you will all know, when we become practice educators, for many people, and it was for me, I'm going back 20 years, but it was for me the first time I was ever a line manager of any description, and I think that that is the case for many people, and so if that is the case for you or for members of your team, then that is an area that is for your own supervision and learning and development, isn't it? And because whether you have one student or whether you have several, you're ultimately being their line manager. And if you've never had an experience around that, if you don't have your own knowledge and skills around all the boring side, the processes, you know, what happens if somebody's not very well and those sorts of things. But the other side around things like the dynamics, just as you would if you were looking after a team, a small team, a large team, a team of full of OTs or a mixed discipline team. That's what line management is about. That's what leadership is about, in part, is about having those supervisions, those open conversations, being able, as Sharon said, to take what feels like a sticky situation in the moment as a real learning opportunity. Because the truth of it is, we all have to work in mixed teams. You know, very few of us work entirely on our own. And even if we do, we're interacting with other services and so on, as well as our patients. And so, to me, it's all part of learning. It's no good if students have these perfect placements with no challenges whatsoever, because how will they manage in the real world when they get there? So you know, I think there's learning on both sides, and I think having a student generally makes us better clinicians, but I think it also makes us better leaders and managers for these reasons. You know, it will make Sharon the most excellent team lead in her new role because she's done it. You know, she's done it for the last 2 years. Just moving on a little bit, very briefly, about the coaching approach. It may be something that you already do in practice, and I think it's very good when you have a single learner or multiple. And when you have multiple students, I think for your own sanity, it's absolutely key that we use a coaching type approach. And in very brief, what I mean by that is, of course, initially, anybody starting in a new service, in a new team, on a new placement, they will need lots of information, won't they? They need to gain knowledge and understanding about what their role is, how OT works in that particular setting, and so on. But as they go through, we absolutely need to move along that continuum so that we are really using the art of questioning in a kind and careful way, respectful and civil way, so that our learners feel that they're in a space that's safe to get things wrong. You know, if they're asked a question and they don't know the answer, one of those things I talk about in the very first week is, it's okay if you don't know the answer. That's why you're here. What I need you to do is tell me that you don't know, or tell me what you are thinking, even if you think, gosh, I'm not sure if this is even on the right track. Because if somebody says that, then we can help fill those gaps, can't we? So it's the coaching approach is key, because if you spend all day every day, as Sharon was, sometimes with 2, 3, 4, 8, 10, occasionally more students around her. I mean, talk about wearing your name out. It's like having lots of children, I think, in the nicest possible way. You know, they're all going, mum, 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 and you're like, ah. And sometimes it, Sharon, 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 Sharon. And it's quite funny, because if you answer every question, you become that's all you are. You become Google. And actually, you need to use that coaching approach, set it up from the beginning, so that actually they're using that opportunity in that multiple student model to talk to each other first before they come to you. Because actually, maybe their peer knows, maybe their peer has an idea, maybe they can work it out together, maybe they get so used to the questions that we ask, i.e., what thoughts do you already have? How can you find out more information about this? Who could you speak to? What could you where could you look? Before then, they come with maybe a partially formed answer, and then we can give them further information or show them what they need to do. So using the coaching approach is absolutely key for their learning, deeper, more reflective, critical learning, and also for your sanity as an educator. But you need to set them up. They need to learn how to do that. And I think just for the last couple of minutes, Sharon, should we talk about the benefits and the challenges? We've kind of touched on these as we've gone through. Do you want to start? What benefits do you think there are to having multiple students?
Well, this links into some of the articles I think that you're going to share. This way of working is about moving away from that traditional one-to-one experience. By doing this, we can start. Ooh, I seem to have moved somewhere on the screen.
Sorry, I've just stopped sharing for a second because I thought we'd see face.
That's all right. By doing this, you have more students, and it creates this environment that they can learn from each other, develop that peer support, that networking, developing their leadership skills, bouncing ideas off each other, giving them the opportunity to speak to another student and not just a clinician. Clearly that's important, but they often need that time to, oh, well, have you done this? Well, this is what I've done. Is oh, okay, maybe I'll do that. And I think that helps facilitate and encourage that in terms of a benefit. I think for the team, again, I'd allude to the ward where I had this experience on. It was very good to have as many students because we were able to, and we'll touch really briefly on this, Liz, I know this could go on, but in terms of our group experience within an acute setting, so with having 4 OT students, I was able to allow them the space to be able to think autonomously and create ideas and think about occupations and tasks for patients to have an impact on the occupational deprivation that's happening on a lot of the elderly care wards, and particularly the ward that we were on. So they had that space to create a group, run the group, and look at the actual evidence to support that. So again, that gave them the space, and this was their kind of pet project and their legacy to Ward 12, actually, and it set up the ward that we were on to kind of think about maybe incorporating occupations and tasks that can reduce that deprivation.
Yeah, absolutely. So there were benefits for our learners, for us in our experiences, and actually for our patients and the team on the ward, really. And I think the opportunity in groups for them to consider the other pillars of practice aside from just purely clinical. There are real project opportunities there for people, and the idea of needing to use negotiation skills between each other when they're prioritizing their caseload, all those kinds of things. They're all real benefits to setting them up for real life. And I think just finally, the challenges, we've touched on some of these things. There is a reality to the fact that there is more of a time commitment, and I think that it is just worth saying that the model we are coming from is not normal practice, in the sense that Sharon's pure role was as clinical educator, so her caseload was only through the students. However, having 2 or more OT learners with you is absolutely feasible alongside your normal caseload, as long as you're doing the planning and working with that whole team approach, so that people can spend time, the learners can spend time with others. You don't have to have a student stapled only to you. In fact, it's much better if they can experience other people. The dynamics we touched on can be a challenge, but ultimately often everybody comes out the better for moving through the difficulties, and I guess just physical space, so having several students can be quite difficult. Having 2 is much less of a physical space challenge. But I'll pause, Jen, because otherwise we'll talk forever, and I'll hand back over to you to think about discussions. I haven't looked at the chat or anything.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.